Good evening, folks. I'm Del Good, and I am chair of the Yoder Department, Yoder Public Affairs Lecture Committee at Goshen College. I want to welcome each of you to this virtual public affairs lecture. Needless to say, when we began planning this presentation, we had no idea that we would not be able to meet in person on campus. So I want to say a special thank you to all who are participating in this alternative format. Frank and Betty Jo Yoder Endowed Lectureship in Public Affairs was established in 1978 to enable faculty, students, and the local community to hear nationally recognized speakers address important current issues. Past lecturers have included scholars, activists, journalists, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, ambassadors, and others with important insights on current issues. And I'm sure you will agree that this evening's topic relating to the national elections is timely and important. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the other members of the committee: Richard Aguirre, Jody Byler, Brian Yoder Schlabach, Jan Shetler, Dwayne Stolzfus, and Todd Yoder. Thank you to each of the committee members for your work on behalf of the Goshen community to help plan the continuation of this lecture series, even in this pandemic year. And now I've asked Richard Aguirre, Community Impact Coordinator for Goshen College and a member of our committee, to introduce our evening speaker. Richard.
Good evening. My name is Richard Aguirre, and welcome to this special Yoder Public Affairs lecture by Professor Elizabeth Ann Bennion, a presidential election preview, What Voters Need to Know. Tonight, you're in for a treat and a respite, a welcome break from extreme election reporting and analysis. No shouting, no arguments, and no insults. Instead, you'll enjoy a well-researched and well-reasoned examination of the presidential campaign by Indiana's leading political and elections expert. In 20 days, we'll face an election like no other. A nation facing the COVID-19 pandemic, international threats, economic hardships, healthcare challenges, climate change, and racial and ethnic turmoil. By our collective decision on November the 3rd, voters will determine how our next president will respond. As many have said, both Republicans and Democrats, this may be the most important presidential election in our lifetimes. Helping us better understand the election is Dr. Elizabeth Bennion, a professor of political science and campus director of the American Democracy Project at Indiana University South Bend. She is also the host of Politically Speaking, a weekly examination of the local, state, and national issues affecting Michiana. You can watch it Fridays at 7, Sundays at 2, or Mondays at 5 p.m. on WNIT. Professor Bennion earned her undergraduate degrees in American Studies from Smith College and her master's and doctoral degrees, both in political science, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Bennion joined IUSB's Political Science Department in 1999. She teaches courses in U.S. politics with an emphasis on political behavior. She also organizes nonpartisan voter outreach initiatives, including a Civic Leadership Academy and candidate debates for municipal, county, state, and national political races. Dr. Bennion is a professor of the nonpartisan Indiana Debate Commission. On October 28, she will make the opening and closing remarks at the televised debate between incumbent Representative Jackie Walorski and Pat Hackett for the 2nd Congressional District. That district includes Goshen, Elkhart, and South Bend. A nationally recognized expert on civic education and political engagement, Professor Bennion has won many awards for her teaching, scholarly achievement, and public service, and she has been published widely in academic books, journals, and newsletters. Dr. Bennion lives in South Bend with her husband and 4 children. Before asking her to come, I would like to let you know that we welcome questions for after this presentation. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of the page, the Q&A function, not the chat, and send your questions whenever you would like during this presentation. And now, Dr. Bennion, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that folks who are watching can see my slides. And today, what I said that I would talk about is the presidential election. I'm sure that everybody is aware that it's happening as we speak. We have people already going to the polls to cast their ballots for president and also for other important offices. So the agenda is to talk a little bit about the 2020 election, with a quick reminder that it's not just the presidency. Talk a little bit about key issues, those issues that voters tell us are most important to them in 2020, and the candidates' positions on those issues. A little bit about vote choice. How do people decide who to vote for? How many of those elusive undecided voters are there? And how do the communities in which we live affect our vote choice? We'll look briefly at the electoral map, especially at those swing states that get all of the attention during the presidential elections. And then we'll look at some current forecasting models and predictions. And I'll offer some caveats and tell you why I think you shouldn't let any of those models affect your voting behavior. And I'd like to close with some reflections on the future of American democracy, particularly as it's practiced here in the United States. So first of all, the 2020 election is a presidential election. We call the election in 2022 or 2018 a midterm election because Congress is at the top of the ballot and there's no president on the ballot. And then we also have municipal election years where you may have only city officials, such as 2019. But although we call it the presidential election, I like to remind people, especially those people who say, oh, because of the Electoral College, my vote doesn't matter. I know how my state will vote, and all of those electoral votes will go to the winner, so I'll just stay home. That, in fact, it's not just the presidency on your ballot. So the governor, secretary of state, US Congress, State House, State Senate, county commissioners, county council, surveyor, treasurer, recorder, school board, all of these are really critical to our lives, to the education of our children, to decisions about land use in our community. So there are a number of issues that are important, but sometimes people don't feel like they know as much about these down ballot races. And that's why I'm pleased to be involved in creating the Vote 411 online voter guide. And this is a guide that is all across the country, but local League of Women Voters working with groups like the American Democracy Project have candidates directly enter their positions, their answers to key questions so that you can compare them side by side and learn a little bit about those races that you may know less about. And so I encourage you to check that out, as well as Campus Election Engagement Project, where they have voter guides that you can access online and really start to get to know those candidates before you either mail in your ballot or go to the polls. I am also involved in candidate debates because, again, I think it's important for people to be able to compare the candidates side by side. I also think these debates are interesting to learn more about whoever will be your future representative, even if you've already cast your vote. So on October 28th, those of you in the 2nd Congressional District, I would encourage you to tune in and watch the 2nd Congressional District candidates debate. It will be on all of the major news networks as well as WVPE. And for those folks who are associated with any Indiana college or university, we invite you to a debate watch party for the gubernatorial debates, both on October 20th and October 27th. Eric Holcomb, the incumbent, will be debating Woody Myers, the Democratic challenger, and Donald Rainwater, the Libertarian challenger. So those should be quite interesting too, and we invite you to join us on Discord and chat and learn more about state politics and issues that matter here in the state of Indiana. So just a reminder that we have lots of elections going on, even though we call it a presidential election. The other thing to remember is, of course, the election is not just taking place on election day. Some of you may have already cast a ballot. We did have voter registration closed 29 days before the November 3rd election. And then right after that, 28 days before the election, we start with early voting. It's actually in-person absentee voting because those ballots are not counted until election day. But you can find your polling place at vote411.org or indianavoters.com. And that's important for voters to know. Some of you will also qualify to mail in a ballot, and that's been a bit of a debate this year. In the primary election, Indiana had no excuse absentee voting, so you didn't actually need to check a box saying that you were over 65 or would be out of your county for the entire time that the polls were open, or would be working and unable to go, or you are in fact sick and confined to the home, or caring for somebody who's confined to the home. Those are the kind of excuses you need this fall, because the state decided not to offer no excuse absentee voting. And we're just one of a very small handful of states who made that decision. But that does mean that many people will need to go to the polls on election day or during the absentee in-person voting. And so far we're hearing that there are long lines at the early voting locations. So that's a good sign of strong turnout, and we'll see what happens with turnout. But so far it's looking like people are in fact very eager to get out and vote. So what are some of those key issues that voters are really paying attention to in 2020? Well, as you might have guessed, the big issues that voters are talking about are, number one, the economy. This is something that voters always care about. If you think about classic forecasting models in the discipline of political science, they always include economic indicators. The economy is a huge factor in whether or not people will re-elect the incumbent. Do they feel like they're doing better off now than they were 4 years ago? Another big issue this year is healthcare, and specifically the pandemic and how the government is handling the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. So with those key issues, we can see Gallup says the economy is the top voter issue, with 79% of voters saying it's very important to their vote. Washington Post and ABC News similarly finds it as to be the most important, with coronavirus, equal treatment, healthcare, and the Supreme Court listed as top issues. NPR breaks the issues down by political party. And this is interesting, though not entirely surprising. Folks who identify with different party actually have different issues that they're more passionate about. So Democrats are very, very concerned about climate change, as well as coronavirus, healthcare, the economy, and race relations. Republicans say that their top issues are the economy, abortion, crimes and guns, coronavirus, and jobs. So across the various polls, the economy, healthcare, and the pandemic come out as the top issues, but you can see that what people are most concerned about and what's driving their vote does vary a bit by partisanship. Candidates have a variety of positions on these issues. Of course, with an incumbent, you can see how they've handled these issues, and people will often look at the presidential election as a referendum on the incumbent. Do you like the job that person is doing or not? Do you want to retain them or throw them out and put someone new in? So the presidency often works as a retrospective vote where people say, again, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? If so, I might want to retain this person. If not, I may look in a new direction. And so we see that where these candidates stand on the issues that matter to voters. Donald Trump, lower the corporate income tax. Joe Biden, raise it. Donald Trump, increase tariffs on imported products. Joe Biden, don't increase the import tariffs, but do increase taxes and tariffs on businesses that outsource. Donald Trump, no federal minimum wage increase. Joe Biden, raised the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Donald Trump, no tax increase on income for wealthy individuals. Joe Biden, the opposite. And then Donald Trump cut spending to reduce the national debt. on this issue, they both agree that it should happen, though not agreeing exactly where that would happen or how big those cuts should be. When it comes to healthcare, we also see differences between the candidates. Donald Trump wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act, whereas Joe Biden wants to protect and enhance it. Neither, at this point, supports Medicare for All, which was popular with many Democratic primary candidates. There also is a question: if you repeal the ACA, what happens to protection with people with pre-existing conditions? And that's a big concern. Donald Trump says he supports protection for individuals with pre-existing conditions and that he will offer a healthcare plan that's better, much better than the ACA. But we have yet to see what that plan actually looks like. Similarly, Joe Biden says that he supports the ACA and its protection for individuals with pre-existing conditions. In terms of the healthcare funding, Trump would not like to see any increase for funding and wants to have states take a more active role in deciding rates and deciding coverage levels. Whereas Joe Biden would like to increase tax credits to lower premiums for working class individuals. We also see that both would like to lower the prescription drug cost, in part through competition, though Donald Trump would also like to impose work requirements for Medicaid. So depending on where you stand on the issues and what you think will make healthcare better and more accessible and more affordable, that could affect who you think will be best on these issues. What's also interesting, though, about contemporary American politics and public opinion is that we think that people will use those issues to then decide how to vote. But often their partisanship will serve as a filter, and the candidates' positions on issues will sort of educate the voters of where they stand and what they think is right or wrong. So in the past, we've sometimes assumed that people have these issue positions and then they try to match them to the candidates. We don't see a lot of evidence that voters on the whole do that in that way. Many use partisanship as a shortcut, and it's a two-way process of learning where the candidates stand and trying to pick someone who matches you, but also adapting your issue positions based on what people you trust and what people are in your party are telling you is the correct issue position and the correct policy to support. So it is a dynamic process. Now, the other issue is the coronavirus. And of course, we do have differences there as well. Donald Trump would like to allow states to manage their own testing efforts, whereas Joe Biden would like to increase testing sites, provide more testing options, have more of a coordinated national strategy. Donald Trump does not want to see a federal mask mandate. Biden has said he's open to that. Donald Trump thinks that states should end stay-at-home orders, reopen the economy, and he's been pretty consistent on that no matter what the numbers look like. In contrast, Joe Biden sees those stay-at-home orders as reinforced when necessary based on the state or local conditions. We also see the relationship with international organizations, particularly the World Health Organization, being different, with Donald Trump withdrawing the US and eliminating funding for the World Health Organization and suggesting that the organization misled Americans and misled the world, with Joe Biden, in contrast, suggesting that it's very important to be part of the organization, support the organization, and get that international information. There's also some difference with schools opening. Both thought that they should reopen, though Biden gave a bit more, gives a bit more emphasis to local decision making. So where are people on these particular issues? Well, 54% approve of Trump's handling of the economy. But once you start asking who will do a better job on the economy, they're about tied. And some polls even have Biden pulling ahead. And that's a change from the last presidential election cycle. 58% disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic, and 73% worry about their immediate family members contracting the virus or having indicated that it has already happened. 62% say they distrust the president and what he says about the pandemic. and only 21% think it's under control. And you wonder where exactly those folks are living. Certainly in St. Joe County and in Elkhart County, that's not the case here locally. But among Trump supporters, 75% of likely voters are enthusiastic about his candidacy. It's only about 60% for Biden. And that becomes important because so much of the result relies on turnout, and more enthusiastic people are more likely to actually turn out at the polls. And so that's something that Trump is counting on, and the reason why he thinks those rallies are so important. So one of the unusual factors, of course, this year was the fact that the President of the United States contracted coronavirus and had to be hospitalized. And there was a real question about how that would affect the presidential election. Would there be a sympathy vote for Trump? Would there be a backlash in terms of people suspecting or saying that he seemed to think it was no big deal, but now look, he's proof that even somebody who's living in a cocoon of sorts could in fact contract the virus. And then the news that many other people in his circle had also tested positive became, of course, major news. What's happened with public opinion seems to be that most voters have seen this incident as something that has made them less trusting rather than more trusting or more sympathetic. And part of that may be the way that the president responded to getting it, saying even after contracting the virus, upon his release from the hospital, that people shouldn't be scared of the virus. He's saying that at a time when many Americans are seeing people they know contract the virus, and even those who recover are having long-term effects and talking about those effects, writing about those effects, posting about those effects on social media. So we can see in these critical swing states of Michigan, Nevada, and Iowa, this is after the diagnosis, that people were suggesting that he didn't handle the situation very responsibly and that he did not set a good example for others. And so that moment that people could have rallied around the president did not have that effect for the incumbent. Now, what about vote choice? How are people making their decisions? What we know in the political science literature is that partisanship is sometimes called the unmoved mover. It is the biggest factor in how people will vote. Generally speaking, about 90% of Democrats will vote for the Democratic candidate. About 90% of Republicans will vote for the Republican candidate. And in the case of 2016, we saw about 89% for the Republicans, 88% for the Democrats, so always very, very close to 90%. The other big factor in presidential elections is incumbent performance. And so what these long-term forecasting models that will come out, a year in advance, then 6 months in advance, and then in August and say who will be the winner, they really look at economy and job approval ratings. And those are the factors that they take into account in modeling how people will cast their votes. And so this is often a difference between political scientists and the way that they think about elections and journalists, pollsters, pundits who really focus on each and every day and what's happening, what are the breaking headlines, what's the latest scandal, and really focusing on every single little change, every speech, every campaign event, and thinking that campaigns really matter. For political scientists, we know that campaigns matter, but they matter at the margins. You can't completely overcome the fundamentals or what we call reality. So you have reality, and then you also have strategy. And strategy can matter in close elections, but where you have a poor economy, it really puts an incumbent at a disadvantage. If you have an unpopular war, that really puts an incumbent at a disadvantage. And what it means is you could run the better campaign and still lose. So other factors are not irrelevant, but those fundamentals really matter. And in this case, this hurts the incumbent's chances because of the nature of the economy. Now, there's a bit of an unknown here because certainly a lot of the president's supporters say the economy was strong before the pandemic. They argue that the pandemic was something that the president could not help and it wasn't his fault, that so much of the shutdown was either unavoidable or the result of Democratic decision makers shutting down their local and state economies, although we actually see it affected all of the states. So what happens is that there are some people who are just not blaming the president for the economy and say, look, he is the best chance for creating a good recovery. But increasingly, with those shifting poll numbers showing that people trust Biden at least as much as Trump to deliver a strong economy, we're seeing that the overall lack of strength of the economy does seem to be hurting the president. His approval ratings also have never been able to get above that 50% mark, where you really have the majority supporting him and saying that, rating his job performance highly. Right now, I believe he's at about 45%. So that's a problem too. Whenever that dips below that 50% mark, it makes it harder for an incumbent to win re-election. The other thing that matters is candidate image and issue positions. Candidate image with the incumbent is difficult because different people have different ideas of what they want to see in a candidate. They also have different perceptions that are very much filtered by their own partisanship and their own ideology and other factors that make them decide whether somebody is a good leader or not, whether somebody's honest, whether somebody is a decisive leader, whatever it is that they're looking for. And we know that people see Donald Trump very differently and in a very polarized way. You don't have the same agreement on his characteristics or what they mean. Or you do, and some people care and some don't care. The problem then is who could be swayed by this. Partisanship and the economy will matter most and much more than candidate image, but for some of those swing voters, like white suburban women or working class white men in the Midwest who swung for Trump last time, but are now moving toward Biden, a candidate image, if they don't think they can trust somebody, could really be a problem. Or if they think that somebody's not willing to listen or not concerned about the people and their health, all of that can really hurt, even if the same behaviors and the confidence and the brashness and even the name calling might signal greater enthusiasm among the base. It can really backfire with some of these other types of voters. And then issue positions. And issue positions are what we like to think people vote on, and the candidates disagree on many, almost all issues that we might name, and I'm happy to talk more about those at the end of the lecture. But we have issue positions, but often what happens is those issue positions get rolled into a party platform and into partisanship and absorbed there, so we don't see a huge independent effect of those issue positions, except for single issue voters who really vote based on abortion, for example, or gun control. Do demographics matter? Political science models in the 30s and 40s and even until the very early 50s focused on a social choice model of election behavior. And what that meant is who you are determined how you vote. Later, they moved to a social psychological perspective, saying those demographics affect your partisanship and the way that you view the candidates, and they studied those things more. But there's no doubt that demographics change our vote choices, and that's because it changes our position in society, it changes our opinion leaders in some cases, and who we spend time with, who we're talking to, and also how policies are affecting us. And so you can see here this study in contrasts, which talks about Republican and Democrats and strengths in party identification. And so you just see the difference there. White evangelicals, for example, 78% leaning Republican, white non-college men, rural Southerners, weekly religious attenders, Gen X men, right? Versus the Democratic advantage among white college women, millennial women, Hispanic Catholics, religiously unaffiliated, urban Northwesterners, Black women, right? And we saw in the 2016 election a pretty typical pattern emerge, which was that Donald Trump won among men and Hillary Clinton won among women, or at least white women. Donald Trump won people who didn't have college educations. Hillary Clinton won those folks who had college or graduate degrees. The people who were frequent religious attenders, particularly Catholics and Protestants, voted for Trump. People from other religious affiliations like Hindus, Jewish, these voted instead for Hillary Clinton. We saw splits in income, with the higher income groups voting for Donald Trump and the lower income groups for Hillary Clinton. And all of this, of course, is intersectional. So it all connects and matters, and people don't have just one demographic, but it all played out in quite expected ways. One of the reasons, though, that Donald Trump won is there were certain demographics that really could go either way, and that those folks, the so-called swing voters, even though they make up a very small percentage of the population, they came out in high numbers and they voted for Trump. We do see that that is looking a little bit different in 2020. The presidential race stands right now with Joe Biden winning the just plain straight up national polls. And he has the biggest advantage over Trump among women, racial and ethnic minorities, independents, and moderates. So with male voters, this is a very interesting finding because they are both polling about evenly. In comparison, in 2016, Trump won men 53% to Clinton's 41%. So Biden has made inroads with male voters. Also, Biden is polling well with women voters. That's not that surprising, but what is surprising is white women. White women often vote for Republicans, even though we think of the gender gap and the fact that women as a whole vote more for Democrats. And in fact, in 2016, we did see that you actually had women vote for Clinton, 54%, but 47% of white women voted for Trump and only 45% for Clinton, with some giving their votes to neither of those candidates. This year, in contrast, we see that 59% are favoring Biden, and Trump is polling only at 36%. And we see even among suburban white women, Biden is quite far ahead of Donald Trump. And so these are these so-called swing voters that you hear so much about in the media. Now, certainly there are folks who argue there are not that many swing voters. It's really about turnout, and certainly turnout and who comes out is critically important. And one of the problems with the polls in 2016 was not correctly modeling or guessing or predicting who would turn out. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Biden is holding moderates as well, 69% to Trump's 25%. That's a big finding, and that's a big difference because in 2016, 48% of moderate voters chose Trump to 42% for Clinton. So all of those groups that we think of as the swing voters are right now trending toward Biden. That's one reason you're seeing states like Michigan and Nevada and Wisconsin is still a question, but even that, some of them moving into the toss-up category or moving into the Biden, lean Biden category. So what about those swing states? Well, here are the big battleground states for 2020. We see in yellow there at the bottom of your screen, Ohio, Maine's 2nd congressional district, Florida, Iowa, Georgia, and North Carolina are listed here in this by the New York Times as your true toss-ups. Then you have a variety of states that are often considered swing states that have recently moved into the lean Democratic category because state by state polls are showing that Biden is leaning. And then you have Texas, often seen or believed to be a very solid red state that has been having lots of shifting of demographics and a much more mixed community in terms of division between Democrats and Republicans. And we see that's now in the lean Republican category. And so what happens because of the Electoral College is that the swing states and these leaning states get all the attention, whereas states that are considered safe are largely ignored. Just as a really quick review to make sure everybody follows why, it's because in the Electoral College, we have these 538 electors who will decide who wins the presidency. It doesn't matter who wins the general election, the popular vote, if the electors vote another way. Why might they vote another way? Because of their states and how their states vote. And so what happens is each state gets the number of electors that they have members of Congress. So if Indiana has 9 congressional districts, we have 9 representatives in the US House plus 2 senators. So we have 11 electoral votes. And this is how it works for each of the states. But 48 states, all of them except Maine and Nebraska, give all of their electoral votes to whichever candidate wins the state. And that's called the winner-take-all system. It's used in 48 states. And it means that it doesn't matter if you win a state or you lose a state by 1 vote, you're still losing all of the electoral votes. And so that's why you don't see Joe Biden or Donald Trump in Indiana. They assume that Indiana will go for Trump, and therefore Trump doesn't want to waste resources on Indiana, and Biden doesn't want to contest, because even if he can increase support, unless he can get more votes than Trump, he won't get any electoral votes, not even 1. And so it means that candidates focus all their time and attention on those swing states to try to get the magic number, which is 270 of those 538 electoral votes. And by the way, we have 435 House members, 100 senators. So that's 435. The other 3 electors represent Washington, D.C. So that's what makes the math and the campaigns focus so much on those swing states. Unfortunately, for Donald Trump, in the recent days, we've been seeing, again, those swing states move into the Biden column. Now, these are still relatively close, and that's why turnout will matter, because with that greater enthusiasm of Trump's base, if he gets more people out, or if voters who are predicted to sit at home, who pollsters are not marking as likely voters, actually do come out, there could be surprises, especially in these close swing states. So what election forecasters do is try to predict how the election will go. And often they focus on the national popular vote, but increasingly they're realizing after 2000 and 2016 that they need to focus more on the Electoral College and not just on the national popular vote, especially after Hillary Clinton won more than 3 million more votes than Donald Trump and still lost the election. And so one of the things as we think about forecasting models to keep in mind is, again, that difference between political scientists who say there are certain fundamentals that govern political behavior and especially vote choices, and that reality affects who will win, and it's only at the margins that campaigns can make a difference, versus folks who really focus on every single campaign detail as making the critical difference about who will win. Most models will combine these two approach, but we have some forecasting models that really focus again on presidential approval and the economy. And the predictions in August was 2016 of those kind of models was in fact Clinton with 50.8% of the 2-party national vote. Her actual was 51.1. So as much as we hear about how terrible the predictions were, they actually weren't that bad, especially these fundamental models that look at the basics in predicting Clinton's popular vote victory. Those focused a lot less on the Electoral College. There also were polling models that looked at national and state polls. They gave Clinton about a 70 to 99% chance of winning, and they suggested that she would win both the popular vote and the Electoral College. But people were very ambivalent about the economy, and there were folks who voted who weren't predicted to vote. And so, well, we've realized that there may have been some mistakes made in weighting the votes, where non-college white men in particular were undercounted and underweighted in most of the polls, and they came out in big numbers, and they came out for Trump. Now, in 2020, one of the fundamentals polls, one of these polls that looks at those basic factors of incumbency, you know, what the approval weighting is, and economics, and looks at those things over time, is forecasting that Joe Biden will win. Abramowitz has been right almost every time, and so many people are looking at this model. He recently updated his prediction and gives an even stronger chance of victory to Biden. But again, a lot of this is based on the precarious nature of the economy and the fact that Donald Trump hasn't been able to get high approval ratings throughout his term in office. Another kind of forecasting poll is sometimes called a quantitative model, and this combines polling data with various algorithms to try out different scenarios. What if these people show up? What if those people show up? Can we aggregate all the different polls? Can we do rolling totals? How much quantitative data can we pump in here to try to accurately predict what's happening? Perhaps the most famous forecaster of this kind is Nate Silver, and he is favoring, as you can see, Biden to win 87 out of 100 times. Now, note there's still that 13. Another model is sometimes called the qualitative model, and there are a number of these as well. It's not entirely qualitative. In reality, it uses the quantitative model outputs, but also looks at things like the stock market, various spin on recent scandals. And the reason it's sometimes called qualitative is because the researcher and the forecaster is thinking about what they think will matter most. What are they hearing? What are they seeing? And so they're combining some of those newsworthy events with the quantitative data. And here you can see the current prediction of Larry Sabato's crystal ball. Note his 85 toss-ups plus his 163 for Republicans suggests that there's only 248 that are nice and for Trump. You also throw in those leans, but it's a clear prediction for a Biden win. I'll show you one other qualitative prediction. This one from Alan Lichtman is one that is quite different. It's not really a model, but it is a qualitative prediction. This is from a historian, and it was interesting because I recently attended a virtual American Political Science Association conference, and you could see Abramowitz and other forecasters who use a more quantitative approach and have a set model that they apply every 4 years, are very skeptical of this approach. You could tell in the body language and the facial expressions, and also in what they said verbally, which is this is very, very subjective. It may be subjective, but it has gotten a lot of media attention because it's very simple and because this particular model predicted the Trump victory in 2016 when the other models predicted a Clinton victory. So he looks at, you know, does the party have a mandate? Did they increase the folks that they had after the midterm election, the number of seats? That is not true. Contest, is there a serious contest for the incumbent party nomination? Yes. Incumbency, did the incumbent party candidate, is it the sitting president? Yes. Is there a significant, no significant third party or independent campaign? That's true. What about the short-term economy? The economy is not in recession, and that is false. The long-term economy, did that per capita growth rate equal or exceed the mean growth for the previous 2 terms? It's currently false. Policy change, right? Did the incumbent administration affect major changes in national policy? He says it's true. This is where the subjectivity can come in. Social unrest, there's no sustained social unrest. False. What counts, but probably anybody looking at contemporary American politics would say that is probably false. Scandal, are they untainted by scandal? He rates that false. Foreign and military failure, no major foreign or military failures. Again, different people are going to say different things. He says true. And foreign military success, did they achieve a major success? False. The incumbent party charisma, the incumbent party is charismatic or a national hero. I would say definitely a charismatic. But he has faults. And then the challenger, is the party charismatic or a national hero? Is not charismatic or a national hero, and that is true. So what this model does, it's not really a model, but what this the keys do is say, okay, are there at least 7, and that will determine who wins. And because there are only 6, Trump will lose this time, though last time he was predicted to win. So this is one you'll see a lot in the media. It's not one generally that political scientists look at because there's not a quantification of what any of those things mean and how you would determine what's happening. But it does look at what are some key factors that might play into people's assessment as they are thinking about their retrospective judgment of the incumbent, of the election as a referendum on the incumbent. The other thing that folks do, of course, is look now at state-by-state polls. This is today's Financial Times website, and you can see that the polls are leaning heavily toward Biden, but there still are some toss-ups, and nothing is a foregone conclusion. I thought this was interesting, how Biden and Trump are polling in the closest states. What I thought was most interesting, of course, was the top that had Indiana there with our 11 electoral votes, suggesting that Donald Trump is not as far ahead as we might predict for somebody who captured the state by 20 percentage points last time around. And so although it is very unlikely that Indiana would go for Biden, we do see that perhaps the state is being affected by the negative economy, by concerns about the coronavirus, by some of the same factors that turned the state around to vote for Barack Obama in 2008 for the first time since 1964, being the most recent time that the state gave its electoral votes to a Democrat. So a lot of people ask what went wrong with those polls in 2016 and can I trust any of them? Many of the polls were fairly accurate in forecasting the national vote totals, but the electoral victory was not predicted, in part to lesser quality of state polls. The aggregated results included polls of various qualities. Often they were not correctly determining likely voters before including them in the polls, and they were not weighting those voters who would ultimately come out very heavily. And some of that was a surprise because they hadn't been likely voters in the past. The consistency in those polls kind of blinded forecasters to the flawed weighting, and they consistently did underweight those non-college age white voters who swung heavily for Trump, so your middle-aged and older white voters. And there were a relatively high percentage of undecided voters last time around, with about 15% right all the way up toward almost election day saying, nah, I'm not sure which way I'll vote. It seems surprising with Trump and Clinton, lots of differences between those two candidates, but a lot of people who really didn't want to commit, didn't like either candidate and weren't sure what they would do, or so they told pollsters. This made it harder to predict. We don't actually see that pattern this time around. So what I would say is the fact that all the fundamental models with the economy and the incumbent approval ratings, they're all predicting a Biden win. So far, all of the qualitative and quantitative models are also predicting a Biden win. Does that mean that this election is a slam dunk? I would say, number one, the pandemic is atypical. Voters may not blame the incumbent for the state of affairs, including the state of the economy, in the same way they usually would. You also have that enthusiasm gap. And there are these doubts about the integrity of the election. There are voter suppression efforts. There are issues around voter turnout related to the pandemic. So there are a lot of unique, unusual circumstances that, and what does that all mean? It means that none of us this year or in any other year should assume, okay, it's over, my vote won't matter, the writing's on the wall, we should go vote, right? There is a major problem with people thinking that their candidate has already won or that their candidate has already lost and then staying home. Not only does it affect the actual outcome of the presidential election, but it affects all those down ballot races too, where other candidates will be affected by how many Democrats, how many Republicans come out to the polls on election day, and by the total mix of voters, of course, who are there to actually cast their ballots. And so it's really critical that people don't put too much stock in the polls, even if they turn out to be accurate in the forecasting models. Okay. So the future of US democracy, just a small little topic to end on, and then I'm looking forward to your questions. We have a lot of questions this year about the integrity of the election results. And it's important to realize that there is no academic research suggesting that we have a reason to be concerned that massive voter fraud in person or by mail will occur. There have been many, many studies of this, and they simply do not find evidence of this. Some of you will remember the president also put together a commission to try to find voter fraud in 2016, and the commission ended up being disbanded because they themselves could not find fraud. The FBI in 2020 said we have no historic evidence of any kind of coordinated, statistically significant voter fraud affecting US elections. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to be concerned about Russia, for example, trying to sow dissent among Americans and trying to pump fake information out online and try to affect our elections in some way. There's good evidence that they are trying to do this, but that is not the same as Americans actually purposely committing voter fraud or going and stuffing ballot boxes, etc. And it actually would be much more difficult than people realize to do because you still have these elections. It may be a national election, but they're run at the state and the local level. So you have all these different county precincts and polling places. You have Democratic and Republican people working each of those polling places. You have your inspectors and your sheriffs at your sites for all of your polling places. So you'd have to have so many people in on it. The other thing is with the actual machines, like could people hack in? Those are the actual not connected to the internet at the time of the counting of those ballots. So that also is not a concern in the way that people think it is. But there is a concern about questioning the integrity of elections in general, or when the public starts to question whether or not this election is valid. That's a problem for a democracy, because you need to be able to trust the democratic process and trust the election process in order to have a peaceful transition of power and to say, hey, we'll try again next time. And so that is a concern as we think about the future of American democracy and how to protect the integrity of the elections while also providing access to the polls and not disenfranchising voters or using the specter of voter fraud to find more and more ways to make it harder for legitimate voters to cast legitimate ballots. And we do see a variety of different types of voter disenfranchisement efforts as well. The other thing is we're questioning the legitimacy of institutions. Right now we have a confirmation hearing for a new Supreme Court justice. And we hear people questioning the legitimacy of the court because of the partisan nature of a number of decisions and the belief that the court will simply act in a partisan way. And so we're hearing proposals about restructuring the court itself. There is a big debate about whether it's legitimate to appoint a new justice now that will last for a generation, the youngest justice ever, at a time that people are already voting and may or may not vote for the incumbent. And so there's lots of debate swirling there. There's also debate about our US House of Representatives and the fact that through partisan gerrymandering, you can have more people vote for Republicans than Democrats, but end up with more Democrats in your congressional delegation or vice versa. Similarly, at the state level, we have partisan gerrymandering in Democratic controlled state legislatures. We see malapportionment in favor of Democrats. In Republican controlled state legislatures, we see malapportionment in favor of Republicans, where you even have cases where a majority of people go to the polls and vote for one party, and yet the other retains control of the chamber, which means they held all the committee chair positions and they decide what goes to the floor for a vote. And so people are increasingly concerned about this as well. There's also unequal power in the fact that we have shifting demographics, but the US Senate still gives, of course, 2 votes per state. This is an important form of state representation, but it does mean that older, whiter voters are having more political power. And this is also reflected then in the Electoral College. In the Electoral College, it's particularly a problem for Black voters who disproportionately are residing in southern states where they vote differently than the majority in their state. And with the winner-take-all system, their votes are basically erased in the general election for president. And so there are lots of questions surrounding the political institutions that we have now. And this seems to be an election where candidates, we certainly saw this in the Democratic primary stage with the candidates in their debates, are proposing big changes. One of those candidates, of course, was Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, where I live, who was proposing changes to the Supreme Court, abolishing the Electoral College. But we're hearing much more of this now than we have in the recent past. And finally, party polarization. We used to see in the US Congress that you had conservatives and you had liberals, you had Republicans and Democrats, but in the middle, those ideological curves from liberal to conservative within each party met in the middle, and you had groups of people in the middle who helped to forge compromises, and our system really was designed for compromise. That's no longer true when you map these out of the Democrats and the Republicans and put them by their political ideology. There's virtually nobody left in the middle. That's not true with the mass public, but we're seeing that kind of polarized politics, which leads to the blame game. Rather than getting things done for the American people, who can we blame for this? Less cooperation. And that's something that we as citizens, we as residents of the United States really need to think about, and how we can encourage our elected officials to actually think not just about who can claim credit or who can be blamed, but how to work together toward the common good. All right, it is about 8:30, so I will stop now and take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennion. And we have received some great questions. I think the challenge will be to keep the answers at a length so that we can get as many of them as possible.
Okay.
The first one is, and this has been reported widely, that some states are going to be, are already totaling up the votes that have been received or counting them, and others will wait until election day. And I think there's one state that will wait until the next day after the election. What's the rationale for not counting mail-in votes until election day?
Well, this all depends on state law, and Indiana is one of the states that, even though we say early voting, we really mean absentee in person. And that is because those ballots will not be counted until election day. One of the arguments that people have made in the past is that there is some concern that those totals will leak out and become part of the conversation, and those will influence later voters, and that you want to avoid that. And one way to avoid that is not just to trust the media not to report it or anybody to leak it out, but simply to wait and not count them early, and to truly make them just absentee ballots, which means they're counted on election day with all of the other votes. And so that's one of the major arguments that people have, but certainly there have been a lot of people questioning this as we have more and more mail ballots and have to wait for results. One thing I would caution people about is the fact that we have to be careful as the public not to be so interested in speed that we don't care about accuracy, because getting it right is much more important than getting it fast. And the other thing that's really important related to this question is that we do know that there are likely to be big differences in terms of who casts mail-in votes versus voting in person. And Democrats are expected to vote by mail or cast absentee by mail votes in much larger numbers than Republicans. And in part, that's because of the national narrative, with the president as the head of the Republican Party saying that these mail-in ballots are not to be trusted. Fewer Republicans trust them, and fewer are planning to use them than Democrats. What this means is that Republican votes may be counted earlier. If they're voting in person, it will be ready on election night. But if Democrats are more likely to mail in their votes, that means those votes might be counted later. The problem, or the danger, the concern with that is the fact that if the president continues to say that he thinks people are trying to commit fraud and steal the election, and all of a sudden people are reporting out, oh, for right now, this Republican candidate is ahead, and then it changes and a Democrat pulls ahead, it could look to people who are already convinced that there will be foul play as if somebody is switching the results in an unfair way, when in fact it may just be the method of voting that people choose. And so that's important for the public to understand and to recognize and even predict, because we do expect that some of those results will change, just as when on election day we hear different counties respond at different times, and then the results change on the bottom of your TV screen, and it's because certain parts of your county or certain parts of your state are more liberal or more conservative, and those results came in later.
One thing, wasn't it always conventional wisdom, like in prior decades, that Republicans were much more likely to have a big mail-in or absentee vote because they wanted to get as many votes in the banks as possible in case, for example, bad weather would prevent people from going to the polls?
Well, in the past, Republicans, even locally, had been better about mailing people requests for absentee ballots and had been more assertive in that. The other thing is there are some turnout differences. Republicans are more likely to turn out at the polls. They're also less likely to have their mail-in ballot spoiled. And so there are those differences. There are more Democrats in the country, but that's often offset by turnout in person. And then Democrats are more likely to use the mail-in ballots this year. That hasn't always been the case, but if trends hold, they may have more of those ballots spoiled. So what studies have shown is there has been no partisan bias or really result of using mail-in versus in-person voting.
You indicated, and we all know, those of us who've lived here for a while, that Barack Obama did win Indiana in 2008, which was a surprise. Well, this year, there's been a lot of reporting that Joe Biden that there may be a blue wave, and that states that wouldn't normally be in play might go to Joe Biden. But Indiana has not been mentioned in that context. And so someone's wondering, why isn't Indiana considered a potential swing state? What is the difference between now and 2008?
So first of all, as I mentioned, Indiana voted for a Democrat in 1964 for Lyndon Johnson, and then in 2008 for Barack Obama. So we are the reddest state in the Midwest in that way. But in 2008, you had a huge recession. Some of you will remember that Elkhart County had over 25% of its able-bodied working people unemployed. The RV industry was decimated, and people were blaming the incumbent. This meant that people were looking for a change and looking for an alternative. You also had huge turnouts in the Gary area, in the Indianapolis area, and here in northern Indiana, where people really turned out in high numbers who were Democrats. At the same time, you had folks who were Republicans who were willing to look in a different direction because they were blaming the incumbent party. The difference, I think, in 2020 is that we do have a poor economy, but many of the president's supporters say this is not his fault, that he gave us a strong economy, that these factors are beyond his control, and that he will get us through into a recovery. And so I think the dynamics is not just the economy, but how people are feeling about the economy and who they're blaming. Now, I think we do see a bit of a swing in that one poll I showed with the state by states that showed that Indiana was only 9 points toward Trump. That's a big difference from 20 points in 2016, but it's still a huge gap for Biden to overcome. So I would rate that as highly unlikely. I think you're muted.
Sorry. This question came via Facebook. We have people viewing on Facebook. Has there been any research into the factors that influence first-time young voters to select a certain political party? And once a voter is aligned with a given party, what is the likelihood that person will eventually change parties?
So early childhood socialization plays a very big role in how people decide to vote. We grow up thinking of ourselves as a Democrat and a Baptist, or a Republican and a Presbyterian, right? We grow up with that very much in our identity, particularly in households where people actually talk about politics. Now, if your parents don't talk much about politics, nobody in your household talks about it much, you're more likely to have a different partisanship or to say you're independent and make up your mind through peer groups and through that sort of schooling process later on in life. But for young voters, often what they are doing is they're going to be influenced by that early childhood socialization. For those who don't have a strong sense, they're influenced by talking to their peers and by the issues that they care about, which in part are the issues that their peers care about. And we are seeing with this post-millennial generation that they care a lot about a certain set of issues. One of those is they actually celebrate diversity, equity, inclusion. They've grown up in very diverse schools quite often. Most students do go to public schools and that are quite diverse. They also are more likely to be concerned about climate change, to believe it's man-made and want to see government do something about it. And also with guns, to have, for example, background checks, closing the gun show loophole. So this doesn't mean taking guns away from people, but on those issues and the issue of same-sex marriage, young people are more progressive than older voters. And that's true even of young people who consider themselves Republicans. So that's true of both Republican and Democrats among young people. But we do see young people at this particular moment in history leaning more toward the left, but that hasn't always been the case. Oh, and in terms of
would that switch as they get older though?
Right. So the other thing, so we have two things. One is a generational effect, which is if a big event happens in your lifetime. So FDR, those people who went through the Great Depression and then saw that FDR would bring the government to their aid and get them back to work and get the economy going, became the strongest lifelong Democrats, right? And so we have generational effects where that really doesn't change that much over time. We also have some life cycle effects where people may change over time, sometimes, but not always, becoming more conservative over time. But it's less strong once somebody really forms their partisan identity. It tends to be quite stable.
Here's a question that's of particular concern to folks in the Mennonite community, and that is that some have have either said or speculated that if Joe Biden is elected, he'll actually increase spending to the military and potentially could get us involved in foreign entanglements more than Donald Trump, who has said he wants to get American troops back home. Have you seen any definitive analysis that would answer that concerning question?
That's an interesting point, because certainly Donald Trump talks about bringing troops back home, and both in the area of tariffs and in that area talks sometimes like an isolationist. But in terms of actual military spending, we see that Trump has at least as big, if not a bigger, military budget than Joe Biden. So there's definitely not a clear evidence that suggests that that would be the case.
Here's another question from Facebook. Is there any worry that President Trump will do something to manipulate the vote totals through illegal action, perhaps by getting his Department of Justice, Attorney General involved, or other federal officials involved?
I think the way that the reason that many observers are concerned about the president's claims that election results cannot be trusted, it surrounds, and his call to have his own observers, many of whom say they'll be armed at the polling places, is that this is undermining public confidence and also might produce violence or backlash to any result that is not Donald Trump winning, that is assumed to be illegitimate. And he used some of this language in 2016 too, that only a crooked process, and that's the only way he could, or a rigged process would be the only way he could lose. And I think that's very concerning. In terms of actually changing the results, it would be very, very difficult to do, because those results are going to be reported out polling place by polling place, collected county by county, state by state. You're going to have your Secretary of State for each state involved. And so it would be very difficult to actually overturn that. Now, will there be legal action? That is very possible. It will depend. If it's a total landslide, enough so that even the president's supporters say, come on, you've got to concede, maybe not. But if we see in critical swing states needed to get that 270, that it's very close, we may be waiting a long time to get the final result. But again, the president doesn't control the process. His attorney general doesn't control the process. They don't receive all the reports directly and then announce them to the public. And so that particular concern is really not founded. But that doesn't mean that there won't be a questioning of the legitimacy of results, because the president has already indicated that he will question if he doesn't win. Muted, sorry.
This question has started to circulate a lot. If there is a blue wave and Democrats win the White House and the Senate and retain the House, do you think there's chances that Washington, D.C. will be made the 51st state, and potentially Puerto Rico could be made a state?
What was the first part of the question? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
If Democrats win the White House,
yeah,
the U.S. Senate and the House, do you think there are good chances that Washington, D.C. will be made a state, and perhaps Puerto Rico?
I think it's very possible. I think there are many Democrats who would like to see that happen. For many, it's an issue of democracy with a small d, that these people are being governed, that they're part of the United States, and they deserve representation in the Congress, not just 3 electoral votes. For others, there's probably also some self-interest, right? Some party interest involved. At this point, it looks like both Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico would vote Democratic with a capital D. And so there could be some self-interest involved there too. But it is something that DC has complained about for a very long time. And people in Puerto Rico actually have some mixed opinions about it, but many would like to have that presentation. And especially when we saw what happened after the hurricane, where it didn't seem that the island received the kind of attention that a state would receive. I think there was an even larger call for, in seeing this as a matter of social justice. And so there became more Democrats who are interested in considering that. So I think it's very possible.
There's not as much polling done in many states, including Indiana. What do you see as the odds that Eric Holcomb might lose to the Democratic challenger in the gubernatorial race?
I think it's unlikely. One of the questions is, could a blue wave sweep in and unseat the governor? There certainly are people to his right who have been upset with his support for the mask mandate, even if it wasn't enforced by police officers. There are people to his right who have been upset by his deference to local county health officials in having stricter standards in terms of closures, for example, of churches, of schools, etc. But there do also seem to be a large number of moderate Republicans and Democrats who support the governor. He's won handily in public opinion polls in the past, and I think right now he's leading fairly comfortably. One thing that perhaps is helping is that neither the Libertarian candidate nor the Democratic candidate are particularly well funded and active with their campaigns as much as we might expect to truly pull an upset. But could something happen? I never say never when it comes to elections. At this point, though, he's certainly the front runner.
How about the 2nd Congressional District, which you mentioned that you're going to be involved in that debate on October 28th? That is incumbent Representative Jackie Walorski and her Democratic challenger, Pat Hackett. She hasn't overwhelmed in all of her elections, Jackie Walorski. Do you think this could be an upset this year?
Well, that's something that Pat Hackett's campaign certainly is talking about and trying to encourage volunteers to recognize that it is possible and suggest that it's a myth that it can't be won by a Democrat and that a blue wave could in fact help Hackett win the district. We do see that the Walorski campaign is still better funded. She has increased her margin of victory each time she's won. And so it would be a very difficult race. Again, she's favored, but let people go to the polls for governor and for a 2nd district and decide how it goes. You know, it's a matter of, if you absolutely had to make a prediction, I'd say both of those incumbents are staying put. But luckily, it's not up to me. It's up to the voters, and turnout will matter. Who turns out on election day will really decide who will be the next representative and who will be our next governor.
During your presentation, you did show a slide that among the issues that voters believe are important, and you talked about the economy, President Trump is still rated as handling that better, because past polling has showed that when people think the economy is going well, they tend to support the incumbent. Do you think that advantage is still there for the president, or do you think that is slipped away?
I think the thing that's interesting is, in the most recent polls, what we're seeing is that people are saying, oh, sure, like, do I approve of the way he's handled the economy? Yes. But then when they're asked head to head, who will handle it better? You have Joe Biden pulling even 1% above. And that's within the statistical margin of error. But that's important for Democrats, because even though we've had these really good economies under, growing economies under Democratic presidents, that's not actually what people think of in their mind. This tends to be an issue where Republicans have what we call issue ownership, and people think they'll be better for the economy. And so this tends to hurt Democratic candidates. So the fact that Biden is now polling even, or even in some polls ahead of Trump when given a head-to-head choice, is positive for Biden, and also suggests that people still are very uncertain about the economy, right? Whether or not it is Trump's responsibility, the president is judged by the state of the economy at the time of the election. And so I think this can only hurt him. The only possible sort of saving grace for him is that he does have his strong supporters who say this economy was not his fault.
There have been a number of questions about the Electoral College, and you did mention that in 2016 and in other races, Democrats have won the presidency in terms of the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. Could you just do a mini thing of why some people continue to support the Electoral College, why larger states, including California, for example, oppose it, and are there any prospects that that would change?
Well, one of the things about the Electoral College that people will say is that it really represents small state interests. But what's interesting about that is when you look at small states, they actually do not vote as a block. They went 50-50 Clinton for Trump in terms of the presidential votes, and they do not vote as a block in Congress. There really aren't small state interests. Sometimes we think of urban versus rural when we think of small states, but there are more California and Texas farmers than there are in Iowa. So, you know, there is a sort of misunderstanding, but it's a widespread one. It's what I call a myth surrounding the Electoral College. You also have the argument that there will be a tyranny of the majority without the Electoral College. But I would ask what that means when you have only one president. Is it better to have a minority of people electing your president? That doesn't make much sense. When we also think about other arguments for the Electoral College, one is that just a few cities would control everything. But in fact, that's not true. You can add the top 100 cities and you still don't have enough popular votes, even if all of those voted unanimously to actually win the presidency. So there's a lot of confusion about the math as well, where folks think just a few states or just a few cities could completely win the entire college, and that's not actually true. I actually have a full presentation on this, so if folks are listening and want to have somebody give a presentation on this topic, I'm really happy to address it because they are such pervasive myths and they sound so good, and you have online sources that continue to spread them and provide what sounds like convincing evidence for them. But more and more people are starting to look more closely at this and say, wait a minute, what about one person, one vote? Why should a person's vote in a small state matter more than a person's vote in a large state? The other thing is that small states and large states are both ignored. At least 31 states get completely ignored all the time because we only focus on the swing states, which are 19 or fewer, who get all the money, all the candidate visits, and public policy favors those states. And so there is inequality there where one person does not equal one vote. And there are groups that are working therefore to abolish the Electoral College. There are also states that have decided to form an interstate compact so that once enough states sign on to the compact to get 270, the number of electoral votes you need, it would go into effect and they will pledge to give their votes to the winner of the popular vote. And so whoever wins the national election would therefore win because states can decide how to allocate their electors. And so that's something they could do, and they basically would be circumventing the college. Many people though say, let's make it clean and try to do a constitutional amendment. There would need to be a lot more public pressure though to get 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the state legislatures to approve any such amendment, because people tend to defer to what the framers said, even though both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison actually did not like the Electoral College and are very clear on record that they would have preferred a popular vote.
So would there be more fairness if all of the states went to the system in Maine and Nebraska of proportionally dividing?
Yes, so it depends what you mean by fairness. So a proportional system or a congressional district system where you give vote by congressional district and then whoever wins the state gets 2, or just overall proportional, sounds great, right? You maintain the college, you have some representation for the state, you have also some representation that's a little bit more democratic and reflects a little bit better the wishes of the people, not so many wasted votes, which by the way, those wasted votes and that feeling that your vote doesn't count lowers turnout. Swing state turnout is always higher than non-swing state turnout in the presidential election. So we're also depressing turnout with the Electoral College. But with that switch to say, okay, then let's at least let people divide up by congressional district or divide up proportionally so they feel like their vote would count toward the 270, that they could contribute in some way, even if they're a Republican in a blue state or a Democrat in a red state. The problem is that you make it much more likely that nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, because you have 31 candidates, I believe, who got votes for president, because different states have different ballot access and write-in requirements. And so you have all these minor parties who take, you know, some here, some there. And then when that happens, who decides the presidency? The House of Representatives, with each state casting one vote, an equal vote, no matter how tiny or how big they are. So that gets the most disproportionate and the least democratic, with a small d, right? Greatest violation of democratic principles, right? Overall. And so that's the only problem with that approach, is it really does have this inherent danger of throwing the election into the House of Representatives.
You mentioned the fact that there have been no large-scale studies that have showed that there is voter fraud, but we keep hearing about these incidents where there's ballots sent to the wrong addresses to people in states like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio.
Yep.
Do you think this will end up being a significant issue this election?
Well, I think it's already a significant issue just because it's getting so much coverage. But remember, when you have ballots sent to the wrong address or people sent the wrong ballot, that doesn't mean that somebody actually cast that ballot, because they're going to, when they cast it, they're going to match it to a voter file. They're going to find somebody. Similarly, people say, oh, well, we have these examples, these incidents of somebody who, there was one Republican operative who literally was trying to stuff ballots, right? But he was caught, right? And in part, that's because you have to find people who aren't going to vote, because if there's a duplicate, those people are going to start complaining when they hear they've already voted when they didn't. And so there are all kinds of ways in person to catch. You'd have to go from polling place to polling place to polling place, impersonating different people, finding an ID, and being sure that those people didn't already vote. And then with the mail-in, you're going to have to match your signature. You're going to have to, in some cases, they have the scan label, right? And so it really is much more difficult than people like to think of. And so when we hear these incidences, they are incidences of like one rogue actor who's caught. We hear incidences of counties that are sending out and doing the wrong thing, but it gets caught, and it sounds bad in the media. But the good thing is, right, those are not actually cases of voter fraud. So we can't say that it's non-existent, but the meta-analysis of all the studies of vote by mail, for example, fraud 0.00004%. So we're talking lightning strike here, people. So it's pretty small, and even smaller in person.
Even though polls continue to show decisively that Joe Biden is ahead, there is still, I think, a hangover from 2016. And so one of our students asked, do you believe the national polls are effective at predicting who will be elected? Do you believe?
Yeah, so I believe that the polls, if you look even at the national polls, last time they got the popular vote right, what they missed was the state by state, swing state, who's a likely voter, those very close states they were using lower quality polls. So the Electoral College is harder to predict. Polls can tell us what people think. The problem is they can't tell us for sure who will vote. And so people can tell pollsters, yes, I'm a likely voter, but are they? You use screening questions to try to figure that out. And so there can be challenges or problems. Generally speaking, polls are amazingly good at predicting public opinion, and they're amazingly consistent across polls. But election forecasting polls are notoriously challenging because of the fact that you're not just trying to say what do people think, but who will actually go to the polls and who will cast a ballot in a way that is actually valid and counted. And so it does make it more complicated. I guess in general, I would say overall, most of these forecasting models have been right almost all the time, with an occasional blip. And also that we shouldn't base our behavior on the polls. So they're kind of fun to look at and to see what might be happening. But I think whether or not we believe them or think they're accurate, we need to remember that we're the ones who will determine the result, not any pollster.
We've got two more questions. I'm hoping to squeeze them in before we end. The first goes in very closely tied to what you just said. Do voters vote with their hearts or with their brains? Essentially, are they going to do they most often make an emotional choice? Or is it based on their understanding of the policy or the positions of that and what's in their best interest? Are they voting with their head or heart, essentially?
Yeah. I think that's hard to separate out because we don't often even know ourselves. So much of it is partisanship, but that includes both this feeling of belonging and which tribe you're in and which party you identify with, and your thoughts about the party platform and where you stand and what issues and policies you think are best for the country or for your state in the case of a governor. And so I think it's both. We do know that emotion is important. So for example, fear-based negative ads are very effective in driving people to the polls. We might not like the reasons they're going, and there are an increasing number of Americans who are going to the polls saying that it's from negative partisanship, not so much that they love what their party is doing, but that they hate, loathe, or fear the other party. I think that's a problem for our democracy, but it does show that power of emotion in affecting behavior. So I would say both and.
Who do you think is going to be in control of the House and Senate next year?
Well, all of the forecasts that I've looked at lately show that the Democrats will retain control of the House, and that the Democrats are expected to gain control of the Senate by a very narrow margin, although some of the states that are starting to slip toward Biden, if he has coattails, could pull a slightly larger Democratic majority. Now, these polls are very close still, so anything could happen, but it does look like Democrats will retain their majority in the House and are very likely to actually capture a very narrow lead in the Senate.
So here's the last question. I fooled you by asking you an extra question. So here's the last question. There is, according to polling, a growing mistrust of the news media. Cable news stations often seem biased for or against a presidential candidate or party, and information on social media often seems impossible to verify. So where can voters go to get reliable information on the candidates and their positions on major issues?
Well, one of the places that voters can go is to the different candidates' websites and compare what they say about themselves. But sometimes what's easier is to go to a nonpartisan voter guide. So vote411.org is one that I've mentioned. It is a League of Women Voters guide, and they ask the candidates to respond in their own words. And the candidates then respond side by side to a series of policy questions. You can also look at campus election engagement projects voter guides, and those are really good. And in fact, I have some slides I'm happy to send anybody who has questions about this, or you can look at the SEEP website, because if you think, sometimes we hear, especially young people say, I don't know if there's that much difference between the candidates. I supported Bernie Sanders, for example, right? And I don't think, Joe Biden doesn't want Medicare for all, and I want Medicare for all. He just doesn't seem that different, the Republicans and the Democrats. If you look at that SEEP issue guide, you will see these candidates are different in terms of whether health insurance the ACA should be retained. They are different in terms of abortion. They are different in terms of contraception being covered. They are different in terms of policy toward Iran and the nuclear deal. They are different in terms of just climate change and whether we should be part of the Paris Accord, right? Whether or not we should have emission standards required, whether or not there should be tax cuts, additional tax cuts for the wealthy, whether or not there should be certain kinds of aid to the economically disadvantaged, right? We can just go down, and in fact, they have it listed alphabetically by issue area. And you can just see that issue after issue after issue after issue. It's yes, no, no, yes, yes, no. I mean, these candidates are very, very different. So even if neither candidate is ideal for you, certainly some of these issues you will care about, and there are big issue differences. So I do encourage, especially student voters, go to Campus Election Engagement Project, click on their presidential voter guide, and these are all based on statements or actions that the candidates have actually taken, and public statements that they've made, and you can compare them side by side, and this huge range of issues where I mean, there are maybe 2 things in the whole entire A through Z guide, right, where they actually agree. So there are some big policy differences, and it's important to know about them and figure out which matter most to you before you cast your vote.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for engaging so well in the questions. I'd like to just give you a minute to wrap up, but there's a question I really should have asked you at the beginning, which is, why are you so interested in politics and elections, and why do you think others should care?
Well, I think that early childhood socialization was critical for me. My parents took us to the polling place, and we were part of Election Day, celebrating Election Day. And that is one reason I would take my own kids with me to the polling place. 2 of my daughters even dressed up as, election fairies, and they'd have the wings and everything. And, so we have fun with it. It's just part of who we are, right? That's the development of civic identity, which I'm very keenly interested in. And so that was important. The only time my stay-at-home mom left us in the care of my father was when she was off at a State League of Women Voters Convention. Her league was co-chaired by a Democrat and a Republican, and she was really interested in voter access and good government. And I knew it must be very important if she would leave us with my dad, who was wonderful, but really was the sort of typical dad of not knowing how to get the snarls out of your hair, how to cook the dinner, just because he hadn't done those kind of things. But so I grew up with this. I attended my first political protest at age 9. And so I think all of that certainly makes a difference. But the other thing is that once you study politics and learn a little bit about it, you realize how much it affects every aspect of your life. Whether you get your trash picked up and how often, whether or not you have a recycling program, whether or not you get your leaves picked up, right? All of that is determined at your city or your county level. Where our money goes, what kinds of programs we have to assist us at the local, state, and national levels, what kind of programs we have and opportunities we have to grow our businesses, what our taxation policy is, like every single aspect, what healthcare options we have is controlled by politics. And so once you realize that, and how you think of your day and the fact that you ate a breakfast that wasn't poisoned because of the FDA inspections, and then you drove on a highway that was funded with taxpayer dollars, or you tried to circumvent and go around those potholes because the city can only repave every 70 years, you realize all of these things matter, and that we have, and it's important to pay attention and to make our voices heard. And for me, that also means helping to educate others, because we can't have a representative democracy if we don't all vote. It's the rule of the many. And if the many sit at home and let a few people make decisions for us, I say vote or stop complaining, right? But more than that, our democracy really does count on us. And, one of the famous quotes of John Dewey is, that democracy must be reborn again every generation, and education is its midwife. And that's why I feel we need to make sure that people don't take for granted living in a democracy rather than a dictatorship. And the only way we can actually do that is to protect democratic institutions, and also to make sure that we exercise our right to vote, which people have fought for and died for, so that we could have that right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bennion. On behalf of the Yoder Public Affairs Committee, we thank you for your amazing presentation and for your passion for civic engagement. Thank you very much to the people who have watched this presentation tonight and who will watch it in the future, and we will make this presentation available. So we hope to continue to grow the audience. Please tune in to Politically Speaking on WNIT. Please tune in to the congressional debate on October 28th. And you can connect with Dr. Bennion through IUSB if you've really got a passion for learning more about some of these issues. And if you want to help support any of her projects, I'm sure she would appreciate that and would enjoy interacting with you. So again, good night to all of you. Thank you very much for participating today. And good night.